All right, we are now live on YouTube. 7 o'clock even. I think we can begin. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's webinar, 5 Steps to Jumpstart Your Cybersecurity Program. For this webinar, your video is turned off and you are muted. Please ask questions in the chat box and we will answer throughout the training. My name is Carla Fowler with the Tug Hill Commission. I see that a number of participants are from outside the Tug Hill region. Welcome. We're glad you're here because the topic of cybersecurity is certainly relevant to local governments and other organizations throughout the state. For those who may not know, the Tug Hill region covers 2,100 square miles in portions of Jefferson, Lewis, Oneida, and Oswego counties. We are a small, non-regulatory New York State agency that provides technical assistance to the program areas of land use, planning, community and economic development, and natural resource management. Some may know that we organize a local government conference that averages over 650 attendees at Jefferson Community College every March. Tonight's presentation would have been scheduled for the conference, and although we miss seeing you in person, both in 2020 and 2021, we're hopeful that you'll enjoy this webinar and visit our website or YouTube channel for not only a recording of this webinar, but several other recent webinars on a variety of topics. In a minute, we'll share links in the chat of past and upcoming training. Tonight's presenter is Steve Gravel. Steve is with the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services Office of Counterterrorism Cyber Incident Response Team. In his position, Steve leverages 2 decades of experience with information technology, information security, and compliance to help state and local agencies understand and improve their cybersecurity posture. His background includes tenure at organizations in the healthcare and retail and legal service verticals, having held diverse roles in IT and information security that range from hands-on engineering posts to director-level positions. The Cyber Incident Response Team, or CERT, was formed by the governor and state legislature in 2017 to provide cybersecurity support such as outreach, information sharing, and cyber incidents response to non-executive agencies, local governments, and public authorities. We are pleased to host this training and thank Steve for agreeing to prepare this presentation for us. Without further delay, I hand it over to Steve.
Hey, thanks, Carla. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your Tuesday evening to spend a little bit of time talking about cybersecurity. It's a topic that's obviously near and dear to me. I realize that for some folks it may be a necessary evil, but nevertheless, it's been in the news quite a bit lately. And so I'm eager to share more about how you could jumpstart your cybersecurity program and raise the bar a little bit in terms of your own cyber posture. So here's a bird's eye view of what I'd like to cover this evening. Of course, Carla filled us in a little bit on the CERT and how we fit into the overall agency and a little bit about my background. But I would like to spend a moment on introductions. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the risks that are out there that the folks on this call face and others do as well. And then some ways that we can maybe address, breaking up the logjam that seems to develop when people, are trying to get a cybersecurity program started. And of course, we'll share some resources and field questions. And as Carla mentioned before, if you do have questions, just go ahead and ask them in the chat. She'll go ahead and interrupt me and we can just stop right then and there and address them. And we'll save some time at the end for questions as well. So first off, a little bit about the way that we're laid out at the Cyber Incident Response Team. We are part of the Office of Counterterrorism, but it is a team effort. It's a multi-unit collaborative approach, as it says here. Another unit within the Office of Counterterrorism is the Critical Infrastructure Unit. These folks are more concerned with physical security, with critical infrastructure like dams and kind of operational technology as opposed to cybersecurity, but they bring a unique perspective to what we do. And more cybersecurity is starting to play a role in their world. So we've come together, to work and develop offerings that can benefit folks at the state and local level, who need to raise their posture. We also partner pretty closely with the New York State Division of Military and Naval Affairs. There are several National Guard team members who are basically on permanent assignment with us at the CERT and support efforts that we do as we respond to cybersecurity incidents, as we offer proactive services like risk assessments and tabletop exercises. So we really appreciate the expertise that they bring to the table. As far as bucketing out what we do, I like to use the NIST paradigm to talk a little bit about the services that we offer. And if you're not familiar with NIST, NIST is a federal agency. It's the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and they host a series of special publications around best practices for pretty much you name it. But they offer several in the area of cybersecurity. And when it comes to cyber, they like to think about proactive and responsive sort of buckets. So identify, prevent, protect, these are before the bad thing happens. Respond and recover, of course, come after the bad thing has happened, whatever that might be. So the group above at the top of this slide, we offer training and exercises. So that could be anything from a cyber incident response tabletop exercise where we bring together management and IT professionals in a room and walk through a scenario. It could be a phishing exercise where we send a specially crafted message into your organization and see how folks perform. And we also do a lot of proactive outreach. We partner with our peers at the state level to publish and have input on bulletins that go out regarding vulnerabilities. We perform cyber risk assessments, which is really the main thing that I'm involved with at the agency. And then pivoting to the response and recovery side of things, for that same customer base that I talked about, those state and local entities, will offer incident response and forensic services. So, for instance, if you discover that you've been compromised, through successful phish and you have ransomware in your environment, we'll help you to kind of pick that apart, understand what happened, what was the scope of it. If you don't have somebody available to kind of drive the process, we can quarterback for you and provide remediation assistance and guidance to help you get you through that, get you back to an operational state. So that's basically what our agency does, and just to move on, let's talk about some risks. Now, I'm sure many of you are coming to this discussion thinking, I'm a village, I'm a town, I'm a small entity. I looked at the attendance list for this evening, and I see a lot of folks like that out there, and it can feel pretty easy, to feel part of the herd when you're an entity like that, and you think about it, there's 62 counties in New York State. There's over 900 towns, almost 5,000 schools, over 200 hospitals. There are a lot of targets out there. So you might be asking yourself, why would we be concerned with this? It's easy to think that you might get lost in all that noise. You can't even see the tiny little planet or star or whatever is at the bottom of that arrow there, right? But let's examine that logic just a little bit more closely, and think like the bad guys, the people that we call threat actors. So I'd like to approach this by looking at a few different sectors, and I think some of these may resonate with different people who are attending tonight, and some may not. But you can kind of extrapolate and bring it to your type of organization. And for each of these sectors, what I'd like to do is think about, who is it that's out to get me? What is their goal? Why are they attacking me in the first place? How might they go about achieving that objective? And are there any sort of aggravating or mitigating factors that I should keep in mind as I'm trying to secure my institution, whatever that may be? So let's start with education. And in this case, the bad guys or the threat actors that immediately came to mind to me were students, which seems like a weird choice, but we'll get to more about that in a minute, as well as what I would call information brokers. Now, these are criminals at the end of the day, but they're out there selling information on the internet. What are their objectives? Well, when it comes to students, it may simply be that they're looking to disrupt schedules. Standardized tests are supposed to happen at a certain time. The school year, of course, begins at a specific time, and they're kids with time on their hands. And we have definitely responded to some incidents, even within our unit, where at the end of the day, it seemed as if it could have been something where somebody just didn't want to go to school on the first day of school and did some things. As far as information brokers are concerned, their goal essentially is to sell personally identifiable information, or PII, as we refer to it. Sometimes on the dark web, sometimes a bit more openly. You may wonder to yourself, these people, these students, what is the value of their information at this point? I mean, they're very early, in their existence as adults. They're new to adulting, if you will, right? How would they go about this? Well, as I mentioned before, with students, they'd like to disrupt, right? So denial of service is a tactic that we talk about, where essentially you're taking something that should function just fine, say a website, for instance, or a portal, or even this Zoom meeting, and you could potentially direct so much traffic at the service that it's incapable of dealing with it all, and so it shuts down or behaves in a way that you wouldn't expect. So denial of service is definitely one approach. I think, unfortunately, we are all familiar with ransomware at this point. You think about what's happened in Atlanta and Baltimore and other locations over the course of the past couple of years, and you can see where operations can come to a grinding halt. If an entity is infected with ransomware, where they need to pay that ransom to liberate their data, to get their data unencrypted, and so on. And a new wrinkle here is that ransomware perpetrators, often will be willing to disclose the information that they might have obtained as they were encrypting it as additional incentive for you to pay the ransom. So really rough stuff. Another tactic, phishing, and phishing often goes hand in hand with ransomware. That moment of bad judgment that somebody within your organization may have when they receive an email and it has an attachment, or it has a link that they should urgently click on. I mean, there are markers that you could think about that you could warn people to be on the lookout for. And we'll talk more about how to get that word out to your workforce later. So some things to consider in the education sector. This is definitely one where there's some insider threat, and the insiders here are, of course, the students that I was talking about before. The reason that they can be successful in these denial of service attacks, and you might think to yourself, okay, here's a 16-year-old kid, how could they possibly do something as epic as this, against our standardized test platform? Well, there are services out there for rent on the dark web where you can basically buy some time to control thousands of computers and use them to direct traffic at a target. So, I mean, they have the means to do it for not a whole lot of money. Get together with your friends, pull together a few Bitcoins, and away you go. And lastly, just to point to the as far as the information, the PII that could potentially be on offer, students are on the cusp of doing a whole bunch of new things. Soon they're going to be taxpayers. Soon they're going to be applying for credit. soon they're going to be doing a lot of things with the personal information that schools may possess. And they have the additional risk that they don't necessarily know how to be safe with that information. Younger generation, not to generalize, often that for them it's a foregone conclusion that their privacy, really isn't there. They grew up with social media, so they don't necessarily worry as much about their personally identifiable information as others might. So to take a look at another sector, let's just look at local government for a moment and see what some of the risks are here. In this case, the threat actors, we're taking it up a notch here. Threat actors could actually be nation states, other countries, right? Hacktivists, and I've got that in quotes. I think the name kind of suggests what this is, but these are people who are activists, for a particular cause, and they may go about doing what they're doing or making their point by compromising the cybersecurity of an entity that they don't agree very much with, or that's engaging in a practice that they're not happy about. In this case, maybe a local government. What are their objectives? 2020 is behind us, the election's over, but, local governments definitely do have a role to play and will continue to play a role in elections. And so disrupting that sort of process is definitely an objective. Disruption of critical infrastructure can be, a goal for hacktivists, whether it's, that they're not happy with the way that, wastewater is treated, or, maybe the control over a dam or something like that. They could potentially, target those sorts of services. And the way they would go about it, I think we saw a lot of social media activity around the election last year. Not all of it, I think, was 100% genuine. So, there is definitely, evidence out there of disinformation campaigns that have been, run in an attempt to influence people in terms of the way that they vote, or whether they turn out to vote in the first place, or what their position may be on an issue. And it's one thing when those, when that kind of information is coming from concerned citizens. It's another thing when it's coming from, a different country masquerading as a concerned citizen. Ransomware, always at the table when it comes to this sort of stuff. If they can manage to encrypt all the data associated with the county election, then that's a potential threat. That can take the wind out of their sails, so to speak. And then also just the idea of system penetration. And this is one that we've seen, just recently at the tail end of 2020. I know the folks on this call may not be especially technical, but you may have heard about the SolarWinds attack. Recently, there was an attack against Microsoft Exchange, which is an email platform that is widely used across many different organizations, where vulnerabilities, flaws in these software applications allowed attackers like nation states to establish access internally within organizations like local governments, so that they could look around and see what they could see what they might be able to leverage and make use of in terms of exfiltrating or removing data that might be of value to them, or, disrupting operations, etc. So things to think about in the local government space. As I said before, in New York State, counties are responsible for voter registration and polling. They are the point of contact when election night rolls around. A very tasty target for a threat actor. Of course, there's heightened public and media focus on elections. Regardless of whether it's like a big year like last year was, or even some of the smaller elections that we'll see going forward. And then lastly, and this plays even more, at that town and village level, we do assessments for a lot of towns, and the reason that they first come to us, is because they're concerned about their operational technology that controls their wastewater treatment facilities, or, as I mentioned before, the control over their dams, because they realize that unlike, 10 years ago, these things are now connected to their networks. They're connected to the internet. If they're not set up in the right way, it's possible that you could see things like what happened in Florida recently, where somebody was able to access a water treatment facility and change the chemical levels in the water supply for a particular location. And of course, they quickly reacted and got that under control. Fortunately, there was not a lot of harm done there, but it was a wake-up call for a lot of people. And the last thing I'll address in terms of the sector is healthcare. So, of course, across New York State, there are many hospitals, as I mentioned before. A lot of counties have nursing home facilities and things of that nature. In this case, again, we're looking at nation states. Let's bring anarchists into the mix as a threat actor, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. When it comes to nation states, I think there is a drive, especially as the pandemic has been with us and has gone on for so long, for nations to want to be the best in their response. They want to be seen as the leader in their pandemic response and getting vaccines deployed and getting testing deployed. Some of these things are almost starting to get behind us at this point, but there's much work left to do. And there are definitely nation states out there who are interested in making sure that we don't look the best when it comes to these sorts of activities. For anarchists, for the lack of a better term, a lot of times they're just interested in watching the world burn. They look at a particular service. Whether they're hacktivists or anarchists, they may just want to take a shot at it and see if they can do it just because. There are definitely folks out there like that. Same sorts of tactics at play. I won't delve into those too deeply again. Things to consider. Healthcare facilities. When you think back to last March, ICUs, overwhelmed. Right. I mean, that curve just kept climbing and climbing and climbing, and we had a very difficult time coping. And I can tell you that from a cyber perspective, as that curve was climbing and as those beds were starting to fill up, we were starting to field a lot of incident response activity related to a vulnerability that was identified in a remote access solution used by a number of different types of entities, but some of them were hospitals, and it really kind of had the potential to put those sorts of services in jeopardy. So, it was very important that we make a coordinated effort along with our peers at the state level to respond to that threat and make sure that that these services were protected so that we could continue to support that life safety work that the healthcare sector was engaged in. And here's something that people maybe don't think about too much. The reason I included anarchists in this slide is because the fact of the matter is there are tools out there on the internet that you don't even need to host yourself that are basically scanning the internet around the clock, 24/7, 365, just looking for systems out there that are accessible from the internet, that have software installed that is not up to date or that is misconfigured such that it has a flaw that could be exploited, or a vulnerability, as we call it. And those sources of information, I mean, we use them on the white hat, the good guy side, but also threat actors use that information to look for targets. And they may, see that your system is, you've exposed something to the internet that you didn't think you had, and it's vulnerable. And they may take action on that just because they can, and because they can bring a lot of automation to it, so they don't have to expend a lot of effort in order to do what they want to do. And then the last thing I'll mention about the healthcare sector, there's a lot of what we refer to as embedded systems out there. So you think about something like an MRI machine, or something else that once upon a time used to be very old school, but now has a computer in it for all intents and purposes. Those systems, they may be depreciated and intended to be used over a period of 10 or 15 years. I mean, that's the traditional, depreciation schedule for something that's that expensive and that important to a hospital. Well, the operating system that's running on that medical device, the thing that makes it actually work, it could be Windows XP. It could be, something that was released, 20 years ago, and it's no longer supported by Microsoft, and so it presents a situation where I don't think healthcare institutions are always aware of how much risk these devices can pose to their organization because they think of them as long-term investments, and hackers think of them as really vulnerable targets because often they are. So with all that said, let's turn to, how we could maybe do a little bit better. At this point, I think maybe we can agree that the risks are real and significant, even for a smaller organization that may be one among hundreds or even thousands. So why is it so hard to make progress when it comes to cybersecurity? I mean, many of you, just from looking at the attendee list this evening, you hold positions where you may be contacted by technology vendors and they're interested in selling you their latest thing. That this is going to be the thing that solves all your cybersecurity problems. We're going to take care of it for you. We can assist you. It sounds great. And yet still, we see that people like me and the unit that I work for, we have jobs and we're very, very busy people responding to incidents. So why is that? And I would offer up to you that to just draw an analogy that one of the main reasons that I see out there when I do assessment work that cybersecurity isn't really fully integrated into an organization is because not everyone is along for the ride. And that means not only IT professionals, but leadership, your customers, in some cases, your workforce, your third-party vendors. Everybody needs to be along for the ride in order to make your organization more secure. And we'd all like to be riding in this car, I think, as opposed to this car. So let's go through some of the things that we might be able to do, a total of 5, in order to stay out of the clown car. So the first thing I would say is that not having leadership along for the ride is the number one thing that I see that stalls a cybersecurity program when we go in to do an assessment. And we do assessments for everything from small towns and villages to county governments to state agencies. If you don't have leadership on your side, then things just are not going to happen. You're going to be asking the people that you're working with to commit and refocus resources, limited resources in terms of people and funds, and they need to know that they have support from the top to make these sorts of things happen. So here are some things to consider. First off, and some of you may actually be this person. I mean, this presentation is to some degree targeted at people who might be struggling in IT or in their cybersecurity team to get things kind of unstuck, right? And I recognize that you folks, may be on the business side of the house more than anything else. So, think of these from your perspective. Could you potentially be the cyber sponsor that can be the liaison to the information technology folks, on your team, to the vendor that supports your IT, to kind of bridge that gap, that so often doesn't happen. One of the things that we see that doesn't happen especially well is that business risks are not always well related to cyber risks. And when I say that, I mean, your IT director or your IT manager walks in and says, well, we discovered this SQL injection vulnerability on the website, and I just don't know what we're going to do about it. And what they should have walked in and said was, that website that we use to do intake in the emergency room, there's a publicly exposed vulnerability that could take that website out, and we'd have to go manual to do that intake. I mean, changing from the nerdy tech speak over to sort of that business operations speak, and working together to figure out how to make those connections is just so important. Another thing to think about, you know, especially with smaller organizations, resources, as I've said a few times now, they're incredibly limited. You can't build $1 million fence around $1,000 shed. So you got to worry about your crown jewels. And for a lot of organizations, the crown jewels are data, right? So in a hospital, protected health information might be the crown jewels. There might be a few different sets of crown jewels, but sometimes it's data. Other times it's operations. If you're a county government, you may decide that your 911 operations center and its availability, that is the most important thing, or one of the most important things to your operations. So that's potentially your crown jewels, that particular service that you offer. So identifying those crown jewels so that you can focus in and direct limited resources where they will do the most good, where they will mitigate the most risk, is an important factor. When and how often should leadership be engaged? So a lot of times these topics, they get really technical. The temptation on the part of the people who know how to do these things is just to bury you in information and jargon and acronyms and things of that nature. So establish a cadence, where leadership and the people who are executing on the strategic plan that you've hopefully put together should engage. And how should you engage? Is it quarterly? Is it twice a year? Is it annually? Are you going to use a scorecard? Are you going to, kind of pick a few different topics and circle back on them from time to time to kind of, iterate on how it's going? We've moved the needle a little bit on getting that malware protection software out there, or whatever the case may be. Wherever you can, I always like to replace fear, uncertainty, and doubt with facts. I think that folks in leadership roles, they have this sense for when you're walking in and kind of doing that Chicken Little of, the sky is falling, I can't believe it, we're doomed. It's a much more cogent argument to go in, and ask about or point out potentially that the neighboring county, they just got hit with ransomware and it took them 2 weeks to get back on their feet. And here's, what we've heard through the grapevine, demonstrably, these are things that, they might have wanted to do. And maybe we haven't done those things yet. So get specific in ways that people can understand, use facts, use a fact-based discussion. And lastly, on this one, just establish a realistic charter. I find that often things stall if there's nothing written down. Capture some of the things, the topics that I've talked about on this slide in a simple document. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It doesn't have to be anything more than a page or two, but just, write down the commitments. What are your targets? What are the milestones? How long do you think it's going to take? Start simple and then build from there. And as I said, start with the basics. There's don't try to boil the ocean with this stuff. There's a lot of guides out there in the cybersecurity area. If you've ever seen some of these, they almost look like the Metropolitan phone book. And I'm probably dating myself a little bit in saying that, but if you were to print some of these standards out, I mean, they are about that thick. It's crazy. So you got to start with the basics and build, right? What should you do first? And the right framework can help you in making sense of all those options and bringing it all together. And the framework that we like to use is the CIS Top 20 Critical Security Controls. It's one option amongst many. I'm not saying it's the best one out there necessarily. Everybody's got their own take on it. But we like this one for a few reasons, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is in a minute. You shouldn't just accept these things at face value. We'll talk a little bit about the top 20, but you should also look at those controls that we'll talk a little bit about and temper them with your own experience. You may have already experienced some incidents and where the skeletons are in your closets. You know the way that they got in, or you may know that as a criminal justice entity, you're subject to CJIS requirements, from a regulatory perspective, or as a hospital, you're subject to HIPAA and high tech and so on. So, as you look at the controls that you might use to organize your approach, you also kind of layer these things in as well, just to think about. So this I recognize is pretty tough to see. It's a little bit of an eye chart, but this is the CIS top 20. And as you can see, they're organized into basic, foundational, and organizational controls. And that's one of the reasons that I like them. I said start with the basics. Where do you think the basics are here? They're actually labeled basic. Without doing these things, you can't expect to experience as much success with the downstream controls that you may implement later. The other thing that's great about them is they're freely available. So that's cool. They're based on and developed from the experience of past incidents. That's how they started. This is all built from other organizations having no good, very bad days, and then getting together afterwards and saying to themselves, what do we wish we would have had in place before all this happened, so that we either wouldn't have experienced that incident, that security incident at all, or alternatively, maybe we could have made it just a little bit less impactful, a little bit better. So these are updated frequently, based on emerging threats. The big thing now, one of the things that COVID has pushed, to the front is remote access. I'm on from home right now. I'm sure the majority of you are as well. And we spend a lot of our days there. So a lot of remote access technology has been deployed. CIS is about to release a new version of their framework, and I will bet you that it will focus on remote access even more than the current version does. And it will focus on third-party risk management. How does moving things to the cloud, as we seem to want to do, present new risks to our organization? Can we just wash our hands of that risk, or are we ultimately accountable at the end of the day for those risks? So I'm going on and on. The CIS Top 20 is a good way to think about organizing your efforts. And the 6 controls, those 6 basic controls, I'd like to just touch on them briefly. So the first 2, they have to do with asset management. And the principle is pretty simple. You can't secure something if you don't even know that it's there. So make sure that when it comes to your IT assets, that you've got them documented. You know what is supposed to be there. And if you find something that's not supposed to be there, have a plan in place to detect it and get rid of it. And these are things that you can lean on your IT professionals to deliver for you. There are ways to do this that don't involve a lot of manual extra effort. The third control has to do with keeping your systems up to date. I'm sure that we've all lived through Windows updates, among other things. For some reason, Acrobat Reader always wants to install an update. Java always wants to install an update. You've seen these things floating around down there near the clock on your computer, I'm sure, all the time. And making sure that those updates are installed is the low-hanging fruit. If you can get this done, then many attackers will move on. You've officially, kind of outpaced that person who's running next to you trying to get away from the bear. So make sure and keep your systems up to date. A lot of organizations are maybe a little bit too free and easy with what I would call their super users, their administrators. Most often these are IT professionals who are administering systems and really need to have that access, but need to use it judiciously. But we've also seen organizations where they've made everybody an administrator of their own computer, so they don't have to be bothered with installing programs for them or changing settings or things of that nature. And in a situation where there's a ransomware outbreak or something similar, that person clicking on that phishing link, if they're an administrator of the system that they're on, then that's an automatic field day for the person who sent that phishing email. So trying to restrict that access as much as you possibly can is just very important. A lot of bells and whistles with the applications that we use. And when I say applications, think, things like financial packages or human resource information systems that you may have to keep track of your workforce and all the different regulatory requirements and training requirements that they have. I picture the bike, right? And it's got the basket on the front, and it's got the bell, and it's got the tassels kind of hanging off of the handlebars. Well, you need the basket because you got to carry some things, and the bell's useful if you're going to, potentially run over somebody and you want to give them some warning. But those tassels, turn them off, get rid of them. They're just trouble waiting to happen. So, get rid of the functionality that you don't need so that it can't become a risk as an attacker takes a look at you. And the last one of the basic 6 is just to listen to what your systems are telling you. From a non-technical perspective, I would just say that the systems generate things called logs. And basically these are a blow-by-blow, detailed list of all the things that have happened. And, these become incredibly important when you've experienced a cybersecurity incident, because you can identify where it started, how it moved around, where it got to, and these things inform, what your response needs to be to that incident. So, recognizing that you've had an incident, often it starts with listening to your systems and knowing when something is not right. So that's the basic 6. Based on our own experience at the Cyber Incident Response Team, there are a couple of other ones, actually 3 other ones, I guess, that I would like to highlight. Make sure you got backups you can rely on. People call it backup software. I would prefer that they called it restore software, because then you'd think about it the way that you really want to use it. A lot of times these days, we've gotten away from things like backup tapes that you used to actually take out of a computer and go sit on a shelf or put in a safe, or even better, take off site and put it somewhere. And we've started to rely on these systems that just copy data over the internet from one location to another. And as we on the Cyber Incident Response Team respond to things like ransomware incidents and things of that nature, we found that the backups turn out not to be viable, because they are always connected. They're always right in sync with the data that they're protecting. So they're also encrypted. So make sure that you have backups that you can rely on. Boundary defense. Another important thing, make sure that your front door is closed. Your IT people can look and see what's accessible from the internet, and they should be doing that on a regular basis, just to make sure that there's nothing there that they didn't expect. And then lastly, your workforce is on the front lines, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And my recommendation would be to try to turn them into a cyber asset, as opposed to the risk that they will be if you don't talk to them. So with that, let's turn to educating your workforce. They are often going to be the first ones who will see a cyber threat and process, and they need to make the right decision. The phishing thing has been really kind of front and center lately. And, as I said before, we offer phishing exercises and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of other things that you need to address with your workforce. When and how should they share data? This can be especially important in a customer service sort of scenario, where they may field questions from your customers and not know what they should say and what they should not. What practices should they follow to secure sensitive information? Do they have to, is it okay to put something on a flash drive and bring it home? Exactly what should they do if something doesn't seem right? Is it okay just to email you, or is there a phone number they should call? Having all that stuff out in advance is important. As is tone at the top. And when I say tone at the top, I've been in organizations before where we've had to go hover over the CEO while he clicked through the security awareness training and finally finished it 5 days past the deadline. And in those organizations, the culture realizes that the leadership doesn't necessarily value cybersecurity. So that champion I mentioned several slides ago, if they can, kind of be that tone at the top, If they can demonstrate that it's an important goal for the organization to be secure, that will send that message. Phishing exercises can do a couple of different things. Number one, you get a good read on your workforce. Did they click? Did they not click? If they clicked, what did they do once they got to the website? The phishing exercises that we do, we'll send out an email and say, hey, we need to update your credentials or something like that. Please go type in your username and password. Well, did they do it once they got there? Or did they do the right thing? Did they either delete the message or did they forward it on to the help desk? Per whatever your internal process might be. So, it's a good way to get an initial baseline on how proficient your workforce is, and from there you can try to improve. And the last thing, I can tell you that having not necessarily clicked on a phishing message before, but having clicked a wrong button once or twice in my career, you get that moment of tunnel vision where everything just kind of zooms in and your heart starts racing. And there is no better opportunity for some in the moment training, where you can kind of show the user, hey, so if you hovered over this link, you would have noticed that it doesn't actually go where the text said it went, and there's a misspelling over here. And, would this person really be contacting you about this at work? All kinds of different things. So, doing phishing exercises can really kind of take the edge off of a lot of that uncertainty that folks have. Providing awareness training. I realize I'm kind of doing death by PowerPoint to you right now, but I would suggest that your security awareness training be more than just the PowerPoint thing that you step through with a quiz at the end. To the extent that you can do it, and I recognize not everybody can, do a lunch and learn on a topic. And it could even be something to help them be more secure at home. It doesn't necessarily even need to be about work, just getting them thinking in those terms. Talking about, departmental issues. I mentioned before, at a prior organization, I used to sit down with the customer service team, once a year at least, and talk to them about questions that they had in terms of how they handled data, kind of go over some policies with them that were specific to their department, just to make sure that they were aware, so that we could head off problems before they actually happened. Of course, the only way that you can improve something is to actually measure it. And in this case, that CIS Top 20 critical security controls framework that I talked about, we're going to ask it to do a little bit more work for us here. Unless you're able to kind of chart progress or backsliding over time, it's going to be difficult to get the help that you need. We don't need to make this overly complicated, but we do need to, be able to demonstrate that we're making a difference, or that we need more help. So, getting help from people in your organization who can remove barriers and provide resources. I touched a little bit earlier on briefing leadership on a periodic basis, on the progress that you're making or the needs that you have. As with many C-level or executive level briefings, keeping things concise, keeping it to a page, using tools like scorecards or metrics or trending over time will help them to see whether you're actually able to deliver on the goals that were set out in that charter that we started with way back at the beginning. So, as part of that whole measuring thing, just to show you a little bit about how we do it, this may be a little bit of overkill for a smaller entity, but this is an example of how we approach the CIS controls. And in this case, it's a control about control of hardware assets. And in this case, we've gone in and we've interviewed the customer, and we've read their policies as they have to do with keeping an asset inventory and so on. And we've said back to them in the notes, what it is that we saw. And we've also established some qualitative measures as to how well they're doing. In this case, they didn't really have any formal policies in place. They'd implemented some of the things that they should have, in some places. Some of it was actually enforced so that it would actually, happen. But they didn't seem to be talking to leadership the way that they needed to in order to get more help, which is why they're still carrying so much risk in this area. So when you state things in those terms, it can be a little bit easier for people to kind of understand what's going on, or even easier still, people love dashboards, so taking a look at the CIS top 20 controls and seeing where the strengths are, walking, your executives or even your IT folks through something like this, where you can say, control 10 is backup, and, it's about the best we're doing with anything, it's between that and incident response, which is control 19 way over there on the right. You can also see on here, there's a maturity score. All of the, selections that we made in that other slide that I was just on kind of roll into a maturity rating that's basically ranked on a 0 to 5 scale. And in this case, I think an image like this would probably resonate with leadership. We are currently a little bit behind where most others of our type are. We're not the worst, but we're certainly not the best. So, just kind of boiling it down into simple terms like that can make things a lot easier for folks to understand. Again, this is just kind of taking a little bit of a look at our process. We do provide a written report that accompanies, that more analytical document that I showed you before. We like top fives. We like to talk about the top 5 risks that an organization carries, their top 5 strengths, things that we were surprised about. What are the top 5 quick wins that with a small change you could do better? You could mitigate some risk. And what are the top 5 things that it's going to take some runway for you to accomplish because you need budget or you need to secure grant funding, or maybe there are prerequisites or what have you. In addition to that sort of, executive, high-level, targeted top 5 approach, we also break down the things we see into nuts and bolts for the people who will actually have to go fix things. In this case, kind of, again, building on that hardware asset management theme, okay, what are some of the risks that we saw? What do we recommend that you do? And we'll also take a stab at prioritizing those things because we recognize we're going to tell you a lot. In the short term, what should we do? Maybe the best we can do is establish some requirements, for an access control capability that will help to keep things we don't want off the network, actually off the network. And then later on in the medium term, we can go procure that solution and eventually implement it. So we'll help you to try to build that roadmap of the things that you need to do to achieve an objective. Now, I wanted to stay out of the weeds as much as I could because I think I've got mostly a non-technical audience here, but this is definitely a little bit in the weeds. We do, as part of our assessment process, not only a lot of discussion around those CIS controls, but we also perform a lot of technical testing, both outside of your network as well as inside your network. And the point of this slide is that, many times what comes back from all that technical testing is literally hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities for your average organization, say a county government, for example. So, what we do as we go about developing these reports is we attempt to distill all that information down, get rid of all the jargon, and just say, okay, it's these systems that the hosts, all those numbers next to the host, those are specific systems that are missing patches to a database system. And the corrective action that needs to happen is you need to just go install the patches, or if it's maintained by a vendor, get the vendor to go install the patches. So, what you see here on the screen could represent 100 pages of vulnerabilities in a standard tool that's used for this sort of thing. So we go the distance in terms of trying to make sure that it's easy for people to action, the stuff that they have to do if we go in to perform an assessment. So that was all about measuring so that you can improve. The very last thing that I want to talk about is preparing for the inevitable. And as you might have guessed, the inevitable is a cybersecurity incident. It's not a question of if you're going to be hit by some sort of cyber incident. It's a question of when you're going to be hit. A lot of organizations are really good at responding to things like natural disasters, floods or hurricanes or whatever, but what about cybersecurity? I would say, because you're ready to respond to those natural disaster oriented, sorts of events, you may have a continuity of operations plan already in place. And if you do, good for you. You can leverage that potentially as sort of a high level model for your cybersecurity incident response plan. It's not a one-to-one, but it can at least sort of outline some basic themes. And those themes are basically, you want to do what you can to prevent things from happening in the first place. You want to have capabilities in place to detect when something goes bump in the night and you need to do some analysis to figure out exactly what it was. Once you've done that, you want to put a bubble around it, contain it, make sure it doesn't spread any further, and stamp it out and restore things to the way that they should be, and recognize that as you go through that, the reason we've got some circular looking arrows here is that it's not just a linear process. You're going to, as you go down the road, find that, whoops, it actually ended up here too, and so on and so forth. And you'll have to go back and just sort of iterate and do a little more containment, a little bit more cleanup, and eventually you will get back to your normal state. And then that last blue box there says post-incident activity. I would say never waste a security incident, never waste a breach. They are an opportunity to learn about gaps that you had at your organization, things that you could do better next time, whether they're technical capabilities, whether it's not having engagement from the right people on the business side, like your PIO or counsel, or somebody who's ready to speak for the organization. Not having those relationships in place the way that you should. Prior to an incident, things like giving your local law enforcement a call before an incident happens, just to introduce yourself and say, hey, if we ever had a cyber incident, who would we talk to? Same thing for the FBI. We're also there as a resource. Have those things close to hand, part of your plan, which is of course printed out in hard copy, because your systems may not be available when all this starts happening. And then the last bit of advice on this is practice, practice, practice. Look at that plan, look for gaps. I mentioned before, we have a tabletop exercise service that we're just about ready to launch, that'll walk through sort of a mock scenario and start to work out some of the potential gaps that you have in your plan, or help you to develop your very first plan if you don't have one yet. So, going through that in a non-confrontational setting over the course of a couple hours or a half day or what have you, can really serve to benefit the group when something actually does go wrong. So with that, I think the last thing I'd want to offer up is just some helpful resources. And here they are. The first link up here is us. If you ever wanted to visit the CERT's webpage, it's about to change because we're revising our website, but it's up there today, and that's where you can find it. The Center for Internet Security, the organization that created all those controls, they're available at CIsecurity.org. The Multi-State Information Security and Analysis Center is a great resource in terms of services that are available for state, local, tribal, and territorial entities. They do all kinds of monitoring and assessment activity as well, and they're a great bunch. I mentioned NIST very early in the presentation. It may seem kind of strange that I'm pointing to a small business cyber planning and training site, for what is mostly a government audience. But I really feel like this site is targeted very well, at the basics, we're just getting started. We don't have a lot of maturity yet. And I'm not saying that you don't necessarily have that maturity, but we often find that local government is at this phase and needs that sort of guidance. The Global Cyber Alliance. Similarly, they have a small business toolkit that can point out some great resources that you could use to help secure your environment. And then lastly, it's, in some cases it's your choice, in some cases it's mandatory, but the FBI is always there in an investigative capacity if you need them to, kind of try to establish what went on and initiate any sort of proceedings that they might be involved in. And this is the end of the road, here's how to get a hold of us. If you actually experience what you think is a cybersecurity incident, then this phone number rings 24/7. It will get to us. It is only for reporting cyber incidents, and we'll help you to triage and figure out where things need to go from there. Available to state, local, tribal, territorial entities. If you're interested in something other than reporting a cybersecurity incident, if you're interested in some of the services that I talked about, then this email, cert@dishes.ny.gov, is a good way to get in touch with us. And of course, you can also visit our website. So with that, I will hand it back to Carla and see if we had any questions.
Steve, we did have a couple of questions, and I would like to encourage you to throw your questions in the chat if you have any straggling things out there. But one person was interested to know, what are some examples of backups you can rely on?
Right. So backups are an interesting thing. Like I said, in the old days, we used to have tapes, and, I love my tapes, but, there are solutions out there now, and we try to steer clear as a state agency of naming products because there's a potential for, I don't know, conflict of interest there, or whatever the right term is. But I would be looking for a solution that offers you maybe the best of both worlds. There are a lot of solutions out there that can give you that near real-time backup, because they're basically copying information from one set of disks to another set of disks. And those disks might be located in different buildings on your campus, or they might be located, 20 miles apart or whatever, or you could be backing up to the cloud. There's all kinds of options out there. Many of them have you set up in a way where you can do quick restores, because you have a local copy of that data, as well as that remote copy that's out there, whether it's cloud hosted or at another site or what have you. But, one of the critical things that we don't often see with these modern solutions is that there is no sort of durable backup, if you will. It's always the latest up to date. There are backups that are online, and an attacker, especially if their objective is to, do a ransomware, attack. One of the first things they're going to do, and they know what all the backup solutions are, is they're going to go out there and they're going to look for your backup software, and they're going to look to delete all your backups, so that you don't have those as an option to say, I'm not paying the ransom. I'm going to just restore from backup and go about my day. So having a solution that can, say, potentially make a copy of that backup to a hard disk, or a number of hard disks. And then those disks are removed, literally air gapped away from the backup system, not connected to anything, so that if something goes wrong, you still have that. The attacker can't get at those. There are other solutions out there that are cloud hosted where, because of the way the solution is designed, it is impossible to delete some of those backups, even though they are out there in the cloud and theoretically accessible. It's impossible to delete them until they've aged out, until they've expired. And so asking astute questions of your backup vendor and saying to them, explain to me in simple terms, if I experience ransomware, how am I going to recover? That's the key thing.
That's good information. Another person is asking, are the assessments something that communities would pay for, or is this is something that they can access for free, or is it just when they're in crisis that they can call you? Or
Gotcha. Yeah. So this is going to sound like one of those hokey sales pitches from the 70s, but it's all free. The assessment services that we provide, the phishing exercises that we do, the incident response services that we provide. When you have experienced a cybersecurity incident, for state, local, tribal, territorial entities, all that stuff is free of charge. The kicker, I guess, is that, well, with the response stuff, we are responsive, but with a lot of the proactive stuff, there can often be a little bit of a line. So, if you contact us and you're hoping to do an assessment next month, the reality is that you may be doing it, in the fourth quarter, or maybe early next year. So, it's something to plan ahead for, I guess.
Sure. Well, very good. I don't see that we have any other questions. So I think we're good to wrap it up. Steve, I appreciate you doing this for us tonight. And this was just excellent.
My pleasure. We're happy to do it. We're very passionate about the services that we provide. We feel like securing New York State, from the municipal level right on up through is a very important task, front and center, even more so now than ever. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to folks, talk about what we do.
Absolutely. And everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. And with that, we've stopped